Hey everyone, Tyron here from Type Fitness Solutions. Just doing some work at home today, uni study, everything like that. Now today, it's probably going to be a bit of a lengthy video for those that are interested, and I want to talk to you about adrenals, adrenal fatigue, and so-called lack of energy related to the adrenals, and how the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system work together with your adrenal system related to overall energy capacity, sleep, and recovery methods. Now, if you relate it back to Chinese medicine, we have two pathways in our body, a yin and yang, which is related to our qi. Now, the yin and yang sign is the TNC sign with the equal and opposite properties of the black and white, right? And that's to represent the yin and the yang of the body, and that can be linked back to the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system of the body. Now, meaning sides of the yin and the yang, both are in equal parts. That's the whole purpose of the symbol. It means both are in equal and opportune parts of each other. With that, you create a synergy of the body, and that's the Chinese medicine or the herbalism medicine that Chinese apply with their methods of ins and outs of the body and energy and expenditure. Okay, so the adrenal glands linked to the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system of our body. Now, the sympathetic part of our body is what actually helps our adrenal, our pituitary gland produce corticotrophs, which actually tell our adrenal glands to produce cortisol, which is a lower grade adrenaline, to give us that energy shortly needed. Now, when we look at the adrenal glands stimulated by the sympathetic nervous system, the purpose of that is to produce cortisol. Now, cortisol is classified as a low-grade adrenaline, and with that, the properties of cortisol is to actually accelerate blood glucose levels in our body to give us a form of energy to actually survive the threat or the action our body is particularly under. Now, our parasympathetic nervous system is related to the equal and opposite paths of that. So you can look at neurotransmitters related to serotonin, which can actually calm down the cortisol response and relax us. So a sympathetic response is going to give us a very excitatory response, and a parasympathetic response is actually going to give us a relaxing response. Okay, so within that sign, relating that back to our TNC sign, right, our yin and yang is both in equal properties. Now, if we're too much in a sympathetic response, that's an overproduction of cortisol, which can lead us into stress reactions of the body. Now, overproduction of stress hormone cortisol can lead to lower belly fat. So belly fat is one of the number one causes from overexposure to cortisol, related back to the adrenal glands. Overstress responses can relate it to high blood pressure and also low blood pressure. Inadequate sleep cycles, tired, lethargic, coffee puts you to sleep. Those sorts of things can be symptoms of an overstressed adrenal system. Now, what actually powers our sympathetic response is the ability to boost the parasympathetic response of our body as well. So the rest and recovery, okay? So when we're looking at stress response, that's our fight and flight response, which is the cortisol response, our sympathetic response. Now, our parasympathetic response is related to our rest and digest. Now, linking those two together, related to nutrient exchange in the body and nutrient absorption, if you're in a chronically stressed situation or lifestyle that's causing your sympathetic response to tell your adrenal glands to produce more cortisol, you are always going to be in a fight and flight response. Now, things like training, mental anguish, relationship stresses, food stresses can all trigger sympathetic responses in the body. So it's never just one thing. Now, the parasympathetic response is related to our rest and digest. Now, we cannot digest and assimilate nutrients in our body if we're actually not in a rest and digest status. Now, within that, that's producing neurotransmitters related to serotonin, GABA, and they can actually help and calm our body and relax and help get restful sleep. But you can't get that if you don't have if your sympathetic response is overactive. Okay, so when you're looking at exercise, training, work stresses, food stresses, relationship stresses, they are all going to be sympathetic responses. So anything that gives you a drive, a motivation, an anguish, a thought process, anxiety is normally going to be related back to a sympathetic response. Now, to actively boost the parasympathetic response, it needs to be stimulated. Okay, you can't boost the parasympathetic response just by literally doing more sympathetic activities. You actively need to boost the parasympathetic part of the body. Now those are going to be the opposite reactions to stress reactions: more sleep, massages, yoga, are things that are going to give you more of your yin to your yang. So anything that's excitatory to the body is going to be a yang response. Anything that's calming to the body is going to be a yin response, and you need to respond those effectively. Now remember, linking those back to digestion and nutrient absorption. If you're in a fight or flight response, you can't rest and digest. Okay, so both of those things there. Now, overtraining, stress responses are the #1 causes of adrenal fatigue. Now, if you're in some forms, and so-called adrenal fatigue, because they use it by measuring cortisol and DHEA levels in the body through a salivary test, but so-called adrenal fatigue is I don't think is technically classified as a clinical term as yet. But you use susceptible signs of the body and indications through empirical evidence that adrenal fatigue is suspected, things like low blood pressure, things like that. Okay. Now within that, you need to install the calming effects of the body to improve that adrenal output. So training more is actually going to be the less productive way to actually restore your sympathetic response. The easiest way to explain the two in between sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system is something I learned from Charles Poliquin, is the fact that your yin and your yang, your sympathetic and your parasympathetic responses are related to a lantern burning, fire, and the oil in the lantern. Now the lantern burning is your actual yang response. It's your fire, or it's your go response. The oil is the yin reserve, which is fueling the fire. Now, when you're in a chronic fatigue sort of situation, what that normally means is that you've actually burnt out this flame. You've been going so hard for so long, we're not actually actively recovering the yin reserves in your body. Okay, so the fire is going and you've run out of oil, and then all of a sudden you're tired as hell, and your body is telling you need more actual yin reserve. Okay, so within that you need to actively boost that yin reserve. Okay, so things like chronically undereating, overtraining, lack of sleep, stressed environment that you live in, stressed work situation, gastrointestinal stresses, these will all cause a sympathetic response from the hypothalamus in the brain to tell your adrenal glands to produce more cortisol to stimulate your heart rate. Okay, because remember, cortisol's job is to produce blood glucose to give you the energy, and that blood glucose needed to move around your body. Your heart needs to go faster. Okay, so you can test and measure your sympathetic responses related to life by measuring your heart rate and resting heart rate and things like that. A couple of little tools that I use for clients to help monitor their stress levels. Adaptogens for herbs can be very, very good for people with adrenal fatigue, rather than or so-called classified. I use that term very loosely, adrenal fatigue. Okay, so you can use things like to support the adrenal system depending on what's actually going on in the body. Now, certain herbs and nutraceuticals that may be classified can actually increase the sympathetic response so much that it causes blood pressure to increase. Now, that's not very good to give someone if their sympathetic response has already got them high blood pressure. Okay, so you can use things like herbal holy basil, rhodiola, licorice root extract, ginseng, Chinese wormwood, I think it is, that's for the gut. You can use things like these as herbal naturopautics that can actually help boost the parasympathetic response, which in turn boosts the sympathetic response. Okay, so you have to really sort of take a fine-tooth comb about your lifestyle, what you're doing, what's causing the stress, what's caused your adrenal glands to burn out, what's giving you and what's caused the adrenal fatigue to begin with. Now you can do the salivary cortisol DHEA tests. Before wasting hundreds and hundreds of dollars on that, I like to use questionnaires with my clients. They seem to be a little bit more simpler and less cost affording to the client, and you can really give an indication of whether you actually need to do that first, and then you can use trial and measure through empirical evidence to say, look, let's try this first, rather than spending $600 on a test, on a salivary test where you have to spit in a glass all day. Let's try these premises first, testing your blood pressure, testing your heart rate, and see if we're getting a response through that. If we're getting a response through that, then normally you don't need to turn more into sort of the clinical testing side, and you can save yourself some money. So I hope this sort of classifies and gives you a little bit more about adrenal fatigue. It's very a loose statement that I like to use with clients. It's never one thing. If you do have any more questions, feel free to comment below. It is a lengthier video, so take your time to go through it. Send me any sort of questions on Facebook if you want sort of any help or some detailed advice. But here to help, Tyron Jensen, Type Fitness Solutions. Peace out.